The year is 1945. Europe, a continent scarred beyond recognition, is gasping its last breaths of the deadliest conflict humanity has ever known. Yet, even as the war machine grinds to a halt, a new, desperate race against time is beginning, a human drama unfolding on the banks of a river that would become a literal lifeline. The Elbe. Imagine, for a moment, the sound of thousands of footsteps, not marching in unison towards battle, but stumbling, shuffling, dragging themselves and their families across the twisted wreckage of a bombed-out bridge. Picture the faces. Soldiers, once proud, now gaunt and hollow-eyed. Mothers clutching children. Old men. Boys barely old enough to shave. All converging on a single, impossible hope. This isn't a story of glorious victory or defiant last stands. This is a story about the raw, desperate human instinct for survival. It's about a choice so stark, so brutal, that it forced enemies to seek salvation in the hands of their conquerors. It's about the very definition of mercy in war, and how, in the final, chaotic days of World War II, a broken bridge over the Elbe River became a passage between life and an almost certain death. What would drive an entire army, once the most disciplined and feared in Europe, to abandon everything, their positions, their equipment, even their very ideology, and race headlong towards the lines of the enemy they had fought for 6 long years? The answer lies in a calculation, colder and more fundamental than any military strategy. The statistical certainty of death in Soviet captivity versus the overwhelming probability of survival in American hands. Let's transport ourselves to May 4th, 1945. The air is thick with the scent of burning wood and cordite, the echoes of distant artillery fire. The Tangamunda Bridge, once a modern marvel spanning the Elbe, now lies a mangled ruin, its shattered steel beams groaning under an unimaginable weight. It's a precarious, single-file pathway of broken concrete and bent metal, a narrow bottleneck for a flood of humanity. American intelligence intercepts paint an extraordinary picture. German units, once holding defensive positions with fanatic zeal, are abandoning everything. A mass movement of an estimated 100,000 military personnel and civilians is streaming westward through the devastated infrastructure, all headed for American lines. Captain William Patterson of the 405th Infantry Regiment, his field glasses pressed against his eyes, witnessed this spectacle. The American forces had reached the Elbe weeks earlier, establishing their positions in accordance with the Yalta agreements, a diplomatic pact that carved up the defeated Germany into occupation zones. What no Allied planner could have possibly foreseen was that this damaged river crossing would become the epicenter of the largest voluntary military surrender in Western history. This wasn't just a strategic retreat. It was an exodus, a desperate gamble for life itself. To truly grasp the gravity of this moment, we must understand the brutal reality facing German soldiers and civilians trapped between the advancing Red Army in the east and the Western Allies in the west. For years, Nazi propaganda had demonized the Soviets, painting them as barbaric, vengeful, and inhumane. While much of this was grotesque exaggeration, the reality of the Eastern Front was a hellish nightmare beyond comprehension. It was a war of total annihilation, fought with unparalleled ferocity and an almost complete disregard for civilian life or the Geneva Conventions. The atrocities committed by both sides, fueled by racial hatred and ideological fanaticism, had left a deep, unhealing wound. German military intelligence had intercepted Soviet communications, revealing grim projections for Wehrmacht prisoners. The numbers were chilling. Of every 100 German soldiers captured by the Red Army, fewer than 40 were expected to survive and return home. The actual numbers, as history would later confirm, proved even more catastrophic. For the average German soldier, this wasn't an abstract statistic. It was a personal death sentence. Compare this to the intelligence filtering through from the Western Front. Stories, rumors, and then confirmed reports painted a starkly different picture. American forces, while formidable in battle, were adhering to international norms. They were providing food, medical care, and processing prisoners of war in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Surrender to the Americans meant probable survival. Capture by the Soviets meant probable death. This wasn't just a preference. It was the difference between existence and annihilation. The strategic situation for Germany was beyond recovery. 8 million German civilians were already fleeing westward from East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania, their homes swallowed by the advancing Soviet tide. Behind them, Marshals Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front and Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front were crushing the last vestiges of organized German resistance with overwhelming superiority. 20 Soviet divisions for every German division still combat effective. The Soviet advance was relentless, covering 30 kilometers daily. Refugee columns, burdened by fear and what little they could carry, managed a mere 10 kilometers on good days. The outcome was inevitable. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel's final strategic assessment, later captured, contained a single, underlined directive. Maximum German forces must reach Western Allied lines before Soviet encirclement completes. This wasn't defeatism. It was a brutal, pragmatic recognition of reality. The Yalta Agreement had already determined the post-war occupation zones, but German commanders were gambling on one crucial observation. American forces had halted at the Elbe River, as agreed with their Soviet allies. If German units could cross that river before the Soviets arrived from the east, they would fall into American custody. The race wasn't for victory or a negotiated peace. It was for the basic human possibility of surviving captivity. Consider the immense moral and logistical challenge this posed for the American forces. On one hand, they had been fighting these Germans for years, enduring heavy casualties and harboring understandable animosity. On the other, they were now faced with a mass of humanity: soldiers, civilians, women, children, the wounded, the starving, seeking their protection. It was a humanitarian crisis of unprecedented scale. American forces holding the western bank of the Elbe possessed overwhelming logistical superiority. Their infantry divisions had attached military police battalions, field kitchens capable of feeding 15,000 men daily, mobile medical units with surgical capabilities, and vast supply stockpiles reflecting America's immense industrial capacity. Major James Morrison, operations officer for the 102nd Infantry Division, had previously studied mass surrender logistics after the Ruhr pocket operation, where 325,000 Germans had surrendered. His calculations for processing prisoners were sobering. 1,000 prisoners required 3 tons of food daily, 5,000 gallons of water, medical screening for typhus and dysentery, delousing stations, and administrative documentation generating 12 forms per individual. The Geneva Convention mandated specific caloric intakes: 2,800 calories for working prisoners, 2,000 for non-working. These weren't just numbers. They were the difference between order and chaos, between life and death, when handling such desperate humanity. The German forces approaching the Elbe represented the full spectrum of the Wehrmacht's dissolution. Elite Waffen-SS units still possessed operational Tiger tanks and sophisticated communications, their fanaticism perhaps the last thing to erode. Regular army divisions had been reduced to mere battalion strength, carrying only personal weapons, their uniforms torn and stained. And then there were the Volkssturm units, boys as young as 14 and men over 60, equipped with only armbands and obsolete rifles from World War I. Behind them came a motley crew: auxiliary services, Organization Todt construction battalions, Luftwaffe ground crews without aircraft, Kriegsmarine personnel from destroyed ports, and female auxiliary staff who faced particular horrors if captured by Soviet forces. Intelligence estimated 2 million German forces east of the Elbe as of April 25, 1945. A vast, disorganized multitude. The window for escape was measured in precious hours. Amidst this terrifying chaos, a figure of remarkable moral courage emerged: General Walter Wenck. On April 20, 1945, General Wenck received Hitler's final delusional order: attack toward Berlin with his 12th Army and relieve the besieged capital. But Wenck, a pragmatic and humane officer, made a fateful decision that would save hundreds of thousands of lives. Rather than waste his remaining forces in a futile assault on the Soviet encirclement of Berlin, he would use his army to hold open an escape corridor to the American lines. At his headquarters near Belzig, Wenck gathered his commanders. "Comrades," he announced, "the war is lost. Our duty now is not to a dead ideology, but to the living, our soldiers and the civilians depending on us. We attack, but westward, to open a path to the Americans." This was not cowardice. It was calculated humanity. Wenck's intelligence officer, Colonel Gunther Reichholm, had compiled devastating statistics from Soviet-occupied territories. In East Prussia alone, an estimated 300,000 civilians had died during the Soviet advance from combat exposure, revenge killings, and mass rape. Applied to the populations now trapped between the Elbe and advancing Soviet forces, these ratios meant potential casualties in the millions. Wenck understood the true stakes. By April 24th, forward American observation posts reported extraordinary scenes. German vehicles approached the Elbe without tactical spacing, headlights blazing in flagrant violation of basic combat principles. Wehrmacht units arrived in parade formation, their officers maintaining military bearing even in defeat. These weren't beaten rabble. These were organized forces choosing captivity over continued, hopeless resistance. Captain Robert Thornton, commanding a reconnaissance company of the 2nd Armored Division, radioed division headquarters. "German forces approaching our positions are not attacking. They're displaying white flags and requesting terms." Within hours, the trickle became a flood. The U.S. Ninth Army processed 3,000 voluntary surrenders on April 24th, 7,000 on April 25th, and 15,000 on April 26th. These weren't combat captures. These were deliberate surrenders by units still possessing ammunition and fighting capability. The Ruhr pocket surrender earlier in April had established the precedent. When Field Marshal Walter Model dissolved Army Group B rather than formally surrender, 325,000 German troops had given themselves up to American forces. The treatment they received, food, medical care, protection from revenge-seeking displaced persons, spread through Wehrmacht communication channels with extraordinary speed. Radio intercepts by American signals, intelligence revealed remarkable conversations between German units. On April 27th, the commander of 3rd Panzer Corps transmitted, "Americans honoring Geneva Convention at all collection points. Medical treatment provided. Food distribution confirmed." That last point was crucial. German forces had been on starvation rations for weeks. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Units that had fought fanatically for 6 years suddenly cared only about reaching American lines. Sergeant Wilhelm Becke of the 21st Panzer Division later testified, "We had heard the Americans fed prisoners, provided medical care, didn't shoot the wounded. After years of total war, such humanity seemed impossible. Yet we raced toward it. But reaching American lines required surviving a deadly gauntlet." SS blocking detachments, fanatically loyal even as the Reich collapsed around them, had orders to execute any soldier retreating without authorization, viewing surrender as betrayal. Military police units established checkpoints on all Western roads, turning back or shooting defeatists attempting to flee. The terror of the SS was a final, internal enemy. The Battle of Elbe, fought from April 24th to May 1st, represented the bloodiest example of this eastward flight's human cost. General Theodor Busse's Ninth Army, encircled southeast of Berlin, comprised 200,000 soldiers and 40,000 civilians. Hitler ordered them to fight toward Berlin. Instead, Busse coordinated with Wenck to break out westward toward American lines. The breakout began at 2000 hours on April 25th. Leading elements of the 11th SS Panzer Corps used their last fuel reserves to punch through Soviet lines near Elbe village. Behind them came an extraordinary procession. Combat troops, medical units, administrative personnel, civilian refugees, military dependents, even regimental bands carrying their instruments. The column stretched 30 kilometers through the Spreewald forest, a serpentine mass of humanity stumbling through swamps and woods. Soviet forces reacted with overwhelming firepower. Katyusha rocket batteries fired into packed columns. Il-2 Sturmovik aircraft strafed anything moving. T-34 tanks crushed defensive positions and the people manning them. The forest became a slaughterhouse. Bodies piled up at stream crossings where Soviet machine guns had perfect fields of fire. Wounded soldiers who couldn't keep up were abandoned where they fell, a stark reminder of the brutality of their pursuers. Colonel Hans von Luck, commanding remnants of a panzer regiment, described the horror. No longer war, but massacre. Soviet artillery turned forest paths into death zones. We kept moving because stopping meant certain death. I saw officers shoot their own wounded rather than leave them for Soviet capture. The statistics were catastrophic. Of 200,000 who began the breakout, approximately 40,000 reached Wenck's lines and eventual American captivity. The Elbe Forest Cemetery today contains 24,000 graves, most marked unknown German soldier. Another 60,000 were captured by Soviet forces, few of whom would survive captivity. The remainder simply vanished, killed in unnamed skirmishes, drowned attempting river crossings, or lost in the forest's depths. General Wenck's 12th Army performed one of the war's most remarkable humanitarian operations. Defying Hitler's direct orders, Wenck instead established a 40-kilometer corridor from the Elbe River to the scattered remnants of German forces trapped to the east. His 100,000 troops, including elite divisions, held this passage against relentless Soviet pressure while refugees streamed through. The general established his headquarters in a schoolhouse near Furch, transforming it into a coordination center for the evacuation. His staff worked around the clock, organizing transportation for the wounded, distributing the Army's last food supplies to civilians, and maintaining radio contact with scattered German units still fighting their way west. Lieutenant Hans Maymann, serving in Wenck's operations section, recorded the magnitude of their task. We estimate 500,000 civilians in our sector, plus remnants of 20 different military units. No food for civilians, medical supplies exhausted, ammunition sufficient for perhaps 48 hours of combat. Yet we must hold until all who can be saved reach American lines. Wenck personally visited forward positions, encouraging exhausted soldiers to hold their positions. Just a few more days. To his men, many of them teenagers from training schools or elderly Volkssturm, he became a figure of almost mythical determination. He could have fled, one soldier later recalled. Senior officers were disappearing daily, heading west in staff cars, but Wenck stayed. And because he stayed, we stayed. The general's tactical brilliance showed in his defensive positioning. Rather than attempting to hold a continuous line, he established strong points at key road junctions and river crossings, forcing Soviet units to deploy for formal attacks rather than simply pursuing. This bought precious time for the refugee columns, though at terrible cost to the defending units. The damaged Tangamunda Bridge, that precarious lifeline, became the absolute focal point of the evacuation. Wehrmacht engineers had blown the modern structure on April 12th to slow the American advance. A bitter irony that its twisted remains now served as the only crossing point for 50 kilometers in either direction. German military engineers and American combat engineers, once mortal enemies, worked from opposite banks to shore up the wreckage, creating a precarious single-file pathway across the river. The scenes at the crossing defied military precedent. From May 4th to May 7th, an estimated 100,000 people crossed the broken structure. Wehrmacht colonels directed traffic alongside American sergeants. German military police maintained order on the eastern approach, while American MPs controlled the western bank. Both sides understood that chaos would mean disaster. If the crossing became blocked, thousands would be trapped as Soviet forces approached. Lieutenant Colonel William Davis of the 192nd Infantry Division described the surreal cooperation. German officers saluted us. We saluted back. Their engineers asked our engineers for equipment to strengthen the bridge. We gave it to them. Everyone understood lives depended on keeping that crossing open. The human stream was endless and heartbreaking. A Wehrmacht colonel arrived with a complete regimental staff and insisted on formally surrendering his unit's battle flag. An SS general, in full-dress uniform, requested honorable captivity for his men, a stark reminder of the crumbling ideology. A naval captain led 200 Kriegsmarine sailors who hadn't seen the ocean in months, having been pressed into ground combat. Female auxiliary personnel, some as young as 17, begged American soldiers not to send them back east, their fear palpable. Most poignant were the civilians. Families pushed belongings in baby carriages and wheelbarrows. Children separated from parents in the chaos were passed hand to hand across the bridge. Elderly people who could barely walk were carried by strangers. Hospital patients, some still in their beds, were wheeled across by medical staff who had refused to abandon them. Master Sergeant James Patterson, supervising the Western approach, later wrote, "They came in waves, dawn to dusk, then through the night by moonlight. Soldiers still carrying weapons they'd stack in piles like cordwood, women with babies, kids who looked like they should be in grammar school but wearing Wehrmacht uniforms, old men in Volkssturm armbands. Nobody ran. Nobody resisted. They were just grateful to reach our side." The sheer scale of this human tide overwhelmed American administrative capacity. Geneva Convention requirements mandated specific documentation for each prisoner, medical screening, and provision of adequate food and shelter. Processing one prisoner properly required 20 minutes. At peak flow, 20,000 were arriving daily. The system simply collapsed under the weight of numbers. Colonel Benjamin Thompson, Chief of Staff for the 18th Airborne Corps, made a crucial decision. Forget the paperwork. Get them fed. Get them deloused. Get medical attention to the wounded. Documentation can wait. Lives can't. This pragmatic, humanitarian approach saved thousands, but it created administrative chaos lasting years. Families were separated in the confusion, some never to reunite. Soldiers were separated from their units, making accurate casualty counts impossible. War criminals potentially escaped justice in the mass of humanity. But the alternative, turning people away, was unthinkable. The medical crisis was acute. Army medical units estimated 30% of surrendering Germans required immediate attention. Malnutrition was universal after months on starvation rations. Typhus, spread by lice, threatened epidemic proportions. Combat wounds untreated for weeks had become gangrenous. Battlefield surgery units designed to treat dozens were handling hundreds daily. Captain David Miller, a medical officer with the 330th Medical Battalion, performed surgery for 72 straight hours. These weren't fresh combat wounds, he recalled. These were weeks old, infected, untreated. Men had been walking on broken bones, fighting with shrapnel still embedded. Women auxiliaries with untreated injuries from assault. Children with malnutrition so severe they couldn't stand. The supply situation strained even American abundance. A single infantry division carried rations for 15,000 men for 7 days. By May 5th, they were feeding 60,000 prisoners plus uncounted civilians. Emergency convoys ran continuously from rear depots. C-47 transport aircraft dropped supplies by parachute. The Red Ball Express, which had supplied Patton's race across France, was reactivated to feed surrendered enemies. The logistics were a monumental testament to American industrial power and the sheer will to keep people alive. At SHAEF headquarters, General Dwight Eisenhower faced an impossible dilemma. The Yalta agreements were explicit. German forces must surrender to all allies simultaneously. Separate surrenders to Western forces while continuing to fight Soviets violated inter-allied agreements. Yet, the humanitarian catastrophe was undeniable. On May 4th, Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had succeeded Hitler as head of state, sent Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg to negotiate with Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Friedeberg's proposal was frank. Immediate surrender of all German forces in northwest Germany, Denmark, and Holland to Western allies, allowing maximum evacuation from the east. Montgomery, bound by Allied agreements, could only accept unconditional surrender to all allies. But he also understood the human dimension. In his memoirs, he wrote, "The Germans weren't just seeking military surrender. They were seeking salvation from Soviet retribution, As soldiers, we could offer honorable captivity. What the Russians offered, God only knows. The temporary solution was pragmatic. German forces reaching American lines before the formal surrender on May 8th would be processed as prisoners. Those arriving after would be subject to repatriation agreements with the Soviets. This created a deadly deadline: cross the Elbe before midnight on May 8th, or face Soviet captivity. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, later testified, "We knew what we were doing. We were accepting surrenders we technically shouldn't have, processing enemies still fighting our allies, but we also knew what Soviet captivity meant. Sometimes humanity trumps protocol. The period from May 4th to May 8th witnessed scenes of extraordinary urgency. Knowing formal surrender was imminent, German units abandoned all pretense of military order. Soldiers threw away equipment to move faster. Officers burned documents rather than slow their retreat. Entire divisions dissolved as men made individual decisions to flee west. The damaged Tangamunda crossing operated continuously. Even after Soviet forces reached artillery range on May 6th, the stream of refugees continued. American officers ordered their artillery to provide counter-battery fire, technically engaging Soviet forces to protect Germans crossing to surrender. It was one of the war's strangest moments. Americans and Germans cooperating while still officially at war, a bizarre alliance forged in the crucible of survival. At 02:41 hours on May 7th, General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender at Reims. The ceasefire would take effect at 23:01 hours on May 8th. This gave German forces exactly 45 hours to reach American lines. The greatest race against time in military history had begun. What followed defied military categorization. This wasn't a retreat or a surrender. It was a human migration under arms. Intelligence estimated 250,000 German military personnel remained east of the Elbe on May 7th. Within 45 hours, approximately 180,000 would successfully reach American lines. The others would enter Soviet captivity, with terrible, predictable consequences. General Wenck's final operation exemplified military honor in defeat. His 12th Army held its corridor until the last possible moment, allowing remnants of the 9th Army and hundreds of thousands of civilians to escape. Wenck positioned his last operational tanks and artillery to hold Soviet forces while the exodus continued. At 18 hours on May 7th, Wenck issued his final order. The 12th Army has fulfilled its last duty. We have saved all we could save. Every commander is now free to seek safety for his men. It was not a surrender, but a release from duty, allowing his soldiers to make their own choices. Wenck himself was among the last to cross at 02 hours on May 8th, walking across a damaged railroad bridge near Tangamunda less than 21 hours before the ceasefire. Behind him, Soviet tanks were already entering positions his men had abandoned hours earlier. Of his original 200,000 men, approximately 100,000 reached American lines. An estimated 250,000 civilians were saved by his defiance of Hitler's orders. This was a man who chose humanity over ideology, a general who understood that the true measure of leadership lay not in fanaticism, but in the preservation of human life. Individual stories revealed the depth of desperation and the profound impact of this choice. Luftwaffe Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann flew his Messerschmitt Bf 109 west until fuel ran out, crash landing in an American-occupied field rather than risk Soviet territory. U-boat commander Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock sailed his submarine up the Elbe as far as possible, then scuttled it and led his crew overland to American lines. A Wehrmacht doctor stayed with severely wounded patients who couldn't be moved, knowing it meant Soviet captivity, saying only, "Someone must care for those who cannot flee." A teenage soldier gave his place on an overcrowded truck to an elderly civilian, then began walking the 100 kilometers to American lines. He arrived 18 hours after the ceasefire, technically too late, but was accepted by sympathetic American guards, a small act of mercy echoing the larger narrative. The Rheinwiesen lager camps became collection points for this human flood. These temporary enclosures, often just agricultural fields surrounded by barbed wire, held over 1 million German prisoners by May 15th. Conditions were harsh, rudimentary, but crucially, they were survivable. This was the key difference from Soviet camps. Prisoners initially had no shelter except holes dug in the ground. Food was basic. 200 calories daily initially, increased as supplies improved. Water came from rivers and temporary pipes. Sanitation was primitive. Disease spread quickly in overcrowded conditions. Yet the death rate remained below 1%, compared to 35% or higher in Soviet camps. Colonel James Foster, commanding Camp Remagen, faced extraordinary challenges. Designed for 100,000, it held 184,000 by May 12th. We had SS generals next to communist prisoners, Hitler Youth teenagers beside Stalingrad veterans, female auxiliaries requiring separate facilities, naval personnel who'd never seen ground combat, Foster recounted. It was controlled chaos, but we maintained order and kept them alive. The processing revealed the complete Wehrmacht collapse. Some units arrived with complete documentation, enabling accurate recording. Others had no identification beyond remembered names. The once mighty 16th Panzer Division arrived with 312 men from an authorized strength of 14,000. The 246th Volksgrenadier Division consisted of 89 elderly men. Classification proved impossible. Were Hitler Youth members soldiers or children? Were female auxiliaries military personnel or civilians? Were Volkssturm combatants or pressed civilians? American authorities generally chose humanitarian interpretation, processing all as prisoners of war, entitled to Geneva Convention protection. This wasn't just bureaucracy. It was a fundamental statement about human rights, even for former enemies. What German forces fled became horrifyingly clear as Soviet-occupied territories revealed their grim reality. NKVD documents declassified after 1991 confirmed German fears were justified. Of approximately 3 million German prisoners taken by Soviet forces, at least 1.1 million died in captivity. The death rate in 1945 to 1946 exceeded 50% in many camps. Causes were multiple and interconnected. Soviet logistics could barely supply their own forces, let alone millions of prisoners. German prisoners received 600 to 800 calories daily, far below survival requirements for forced labor. Medical care was virtually non-existent. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis spread unchecked. Siberian winter temperatures dropped to 40 degrees without adequate clothing or shelter. Beyond material deprivation was systematic brutality. Soviet guards, many having lost families to German atrocities, showed little mercy. Prisoners worked in uranium mines without protection, in logging camps with impossible quotas, on construction projects where safety was ignored. The wounded and sick were often shot as useless mouths. Former Soviet officer Viktor Astafiev later wrote, "We were told every dead German was payment for our suffering. Payment for Leningrad, Stalingrad, for 27 million Soviet dead." Guards competed to see who could work prisoners to death fastest. To show mercy was to betray our fallen comrades. The statistics told the entire chilling story. American records show that of 3.8 million German prisoners in Western custody, approximately 137,000 died, a death rate of 3.6%. Most deaths occurred from wounds received before capture or disease in the war's chaotic final weeks. By June 1945, the death rate in American camps had stabilized at a mere 0.15% monthly. Soviet records, even official ones, reveal catastrophe. Soviet figures acknowledge 350,700 German prisoner deaths, but German research indicates the true number exceeded 1 million. The Maastricht Commission documented that, of prisoners taken in 1945, fewer than 50% survived to 1950. The differential was starker for specific groups. Waffen-SS members had a 20% survival rate in Soviet camps versus 95% in American custody. Female auxiliaries faced systematic assault in Soviet custody, while Americans generally released them within months. Hitler Youth teenagers were often executed immediately by Soviet forces as fascist fanatics, while Americans processed them as juvenile prisoners, requiring rehabilitation rather than punishment. The choice of who captured you literally determined your fate. The mass surrender to American forces in 1945 had profound consequences for post-war Europe. American and British forces controlled the majority of surviving German military personnel, providing crucial intelligence advantages as the Cold War began. Operation Paperclip, which brought German scientists to the U.S., succeeded partly because technical personnel had deliberately surrendered to Americans. Werner von Braun's rocket team traveled 500 kilometers through collapsing German lines specifically to reach American forces. "We despise the French, fear the Soviets, don't believe the British can afford us. That leaves the Americans," von Braun reportedly told colleagues. His decision, born of pragmatic desperation, would eventually put Americans on the moon. The demographic impact was equally significant. East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania lost virtually their entire male population of military age, killed in combat, fled west, or disappeared in Soviet captivity. Entire family lines were extinguished. The German Democratic Republic, East Germany, would struggle for decades with gender imbalance created by the loss of so many men. The psychological impact lasted generations. Families divided by the inner German border often trace their separation to those desperate days in May 1945, some members reaching American lines, others trapped in Soviet occupation zones. The arbitrary nature of survival, determined by which army captured you, became a defining trauma of German post-war experience, a wound that would take decades to even begin to heal. By 23:01 hours on May 8, 1945, when the ceasefire took effect, American forces had processed approximately 1.5 million German military prisoners in the war's final 3 weeks. The 102nd Infantry Division alone accepted the surrender of 313,000 enemies, more than the entire German army that invaded Poland in 1939. The final tallies staggered contemporary observers. The U.S. Ninth Army reported 423,000 prisoners between April 20th and May 8th. The First Army processed 387,000. Analysis showed fewer than 20,000 were taken in actual combat. The rest surrendered voluntarily, often fighting through their own lines to do so. General Omar Bradley later wrote, "We prepared for victory, not for this. The German army didn't just surrender, it dissolved. Men who'd fought fanatically for 6 years suddenly cared only about reaching our lines. They knew what we learned later. Surrender to us meant life. Capture by Soviets meant probable death." The numbers continued growing even after the ceasefire. Between May 8th and May 31st, another 874,000 German military personnel managed to reach Western Allied lines from Soviet-controlled areas, either through escape, administrative confusion, or sympathetic interpretation of deadlines by American and British forces. Individual stories continue to reveal the profound human dimension behind these staggering statistics. Corporal Friedrich Müller, who surrendered at Tangamunda on May 5th, kept a diary throughout his captivity. "First day without fear in 6 years. Americans gave us bread. Real bread, not sawdust. Guard offered cigarette. I cried. After what we did, why do they treat us as humans?" Nurse Hildegard Schneider crossed the Elbe with a military hospital unit. "We had 300 wounded. Americans took them all, even SS men. American doctors operated through the night, saving German soldiers. One told me, 'The war's over. Now we're just doctors, and you're just patients.' I couldn't believe such mercy existed." Wehrmacht Private Hans Bauer, age 17, later testified, "I'd been told Americans would torture prisoners, that surrender meant dishonor. Instead, they gave me chocolate. I hadn't seen chocolate in 3 years. A medic treated my infected wound. An officer asked if I could contact my mother. They treated me not as an enemy, but as a boy who'd been forced to fight." Former SS officer Wilhelm Hartung, who expected execution, instead received medical treatment for his wounds and eventual release. "I deserved no mercy. My unit had committed terrible acts. Yet Americans treated me according to law, not revenge. That mercy haunted me more than any punishment could have." General Walter Wenck survived the war, living until 1982. In a 1975 interview, he reflected on those desperate days. "I disobeyed Hitler's orders and would do so again. My duty wasn't to a dead ideology, but to living men under my command. Every soldier we got across the Elbe was a victory. Every civilian saved was a triumph. We lost the war, but in those last days we saved what could be saved: human lives." Wenck never expressed regret for his defiance. "Hitler ordered us to sacrifice ourselves for his Götterdämmerung fantasy. I chose instead to save my men for their families, for Germany's future. Between honor and humanity, I chose humanity. History can judge whether I was right." His actions saved an estimated 250,000 soldiers and civilians from Soviet captivity. Many survivors and their descendants still gather annually on May 8th to honor Wenck's memory, calling him the general who chose life over death, mercy over ideology. The mass German surrender to American forces in April-May 1945 represented more than military capitulation. It was a massive humanitarian crisis, an ideological collapse, and, ultimately, a testament to the power of mercy in warfare's darkest hour. The event challenged traditional narratives. German forces didn't simply stop fighting when ordered. They actively sought American captivity as salvation. The disciplined Wehrmacht of 1940 had become a desperate mass by 1945, willing to risk everything to avoid Soviet retribution. For American forces, the experience proved transformative. Young soldiers who'd fought across Europe suddenly found themselves saving enemies who days before had been trying to kill them. The professional handling of this crisis, despite overwhelming numbers and logistical challenges, demonstrated American organizational capability and a fundamental, often surprising, humanity. Military historian John Keegan later wrote, "The German flight to American lines in 1945 was unprecedented. Never before had such numbers deliberately sought the specific captivity while still capable of resistance. It demonstrated that even in total war, human calculations of mercy versus revenge could override ideology and orders." The last German soldier to cross at Tangamunda was Volkssturm member Heinrich Fischer, age 63. He reached American lines at 22:47 hours on May 8, 1945, exactly 14 minutes before the ceasefire. When asked why he'd risked everything to cross, he simply said, "I wanted to see my grandchildren again." He did. Millions who failed to reach American lines did not. Private First Class Joseph Martinez, who helped process surrendering Germans, provided perhaps the most profound observation. They weren't really surrendering to us. They were fleeing from something worse. We just happened to represent survival. Any one of us might have done the same in their position. The desperate German flight to American lines in 1945 revealed fundamental truths about warfare and human nature. Even in humanity's darkest conflict, the difference between mercy and revenge, between life and death, could be measured in the simple question of which uniform received your surrender. For millions of Germans in April and May 1945, that difference was everything. The choice between American and Soviet captivity wasn't about comfort or convenience. It was about survival itself. The statistical evidence was overwhelming. Surrender to Americans meant probable life. Capture by Soviets meant probable death. The final accounting was stark. Of Germans who surrendered to Western allies, 96.4% survived captivity. Of Germans captured by Soviets, fewer than 65% returned home. Behind these percentages lay individual tragedies and triumphs that would shape families, communities, and nations for generations. But beyond statistics lay a deeper truth. The American response to this crisis, feeding enemies, treating the wounded, maintaining order despite overwhelming numbers, demonstrated that even in total war's aftermath, humanity could prevail over vengeance. Young American soldiers, many having lost friends to German weapons, chose duty and decency over revenge. The damaged crossing at Tangamunda became more than a bridge over the Elbe. It was a passage between life and death, between mercy and retribution, between the Western and Soviet interpretations of victory. Those who crossed it before May 8, 1945, generally survived to rebuild their lives and country. Those who didn't faced years of suffering in Soviet camps, if they survived at all. The mass surrender also demonstrated war's ultimate irony. The Wehrmacht, which had begun the war as conquerors seeking Lebensraum in the east, ended it as refugees fleeing westward. The master race ideology collapsed into desperate individuals seeking only survival. The 1,000-year Reich lasted 12 years, ending with its soldiers racing to surrender to armies they'd once dismissed as decadent democracies. For historians, the event raises profound questions. Was American acceptance of these surrenders a humanitarian triumph or a violation of inter-allied agreements? Did saving German soldiers from Soviet captivity serve justice or subvert it? The answers remain debated, but the human impact was undeniable. The legacy echoes still. German-American relations in the post-war period were profoundly influenced by this mercy. West Germany's integration into NATO, its development as a democratic state, its role as America's key European ally during the Cold War, all were influenced by the memory of American humanity in victory. The last crossing of the Elbe was not merely the end of a war. It was the largest gamble on human mercy in military history, a desperate bet by defeated enemies that their conquerors would choose humanity over vengeance. For those who made it across, it was a gamble that paid off with the only currency that ultimately mattered: their lives, and, through them, the future of a nation that would rise from the ashes to become a cornerstone of European democracy. The damaged bridge at Tangamunda, where so many crossed from death to life, was never rebuilt, but its memory endures as a monument to one of warfare's fundamental truths. In the end, the measure of victory is not in enemies destroyed, but in lives saved. Not in vengeance taken, but in mercy shown. That is the final lesson of the German flight to American lines in 1945. That even in history's most devastating conflict, humanity could prevail over hatred, mercy could triumph over revenge, and life could be chosen over death. For the hundreds of thousands who crossed the Elbe in those desperate days, that choice made all the difference. Their crossing was not just an escape from Soviet retribution. It was a passage from the old world of total war and racial hatred to the possibility of a new world built on law, mercy, and human dignity. That so many risked everything to reach American lines was not just a military phenomenon, but a profound human testament to the power of mercy in victory. The story ends where it began, at a damaged bridge over the Elbe, where desperate enemies became grateful prisoners, where American soldiers became unlikely saviors, and where the simple act of accepting surrender became an affirmation of humanity's capacity for mercy, even in its darkest hour. That is the lasting legacy of those desperate days in 1945. Proof that even in total war's aftermath, the choice between mercy and revenge, between humanity and vengeance, could determine not just individual fates, but the future of nations and the judgment of history itself.